20 of the most talented drivers in the world drive in Formula 1, and while they do drive very well on almost every single track, they do have that one track every single year that doesn't go to plan and just doesn't suit, whether it be their driving style, their preferences, or in general the atmosphere itself might just not suit that driver. The 2024 grid is actually stacked with drivers that have been in the sport for plenty of years, and we don't have too many rookies, so we can almost do every single driver. The only exceptions on this list of drivers that we can't do a worse track for is Colapinto, Lawson, Guan Yu Zhou, and Oscar Piastri. And for Oscar Piastri, I can kind of give out a rough one just to start off the video. It would be Coda. Both in 23 and 24, it really goes against his driving preferences. And both times he went out of track limits, had to end up coming back, had a very fast car in both GPs. It just hasn't been Oscar's GP as of yet. I do think he will improve there. But for Zhou, Lawson, and Colapinto, not enough data. Zhou has also been in the worst car, so it's hard to tell. But we can go over every other team and what their driver's worst track is. This is taken off of statistics, seeing all the races that they've had, and which race has just been, in general, their worst throughout the seasons. You will see a trend of certain tracks because these are tracks that drivers typically do not like or love. It's one or the other. But let's get the video started with Haas. Kevin Magnussen, the Viking, a very aggressive driver and a driver that has been in our sport for a longer period of time than I think we all expected. He's been out of the sport 2 times, but he's came back with vengeance. He had a very good 22 season, 23 was okay, and 24, it's also been okay, very up and down. K-Mag is very particular because he's actually okay through most of the tracks, but Monaco, weirdly enough, is the track that he suffers on the most. And it's mainly to do with that he usually crashes out, whether that be in qualifying or the race, and he's not really able to make up positions the aggressive way that K-Mag does. And Monaco, unfortunately, kind of just sits in that spot where you can't overtake, and qualifying's never been K-Mag's highlight. So Monaco is his worst track, and his teammates, actually funny enough, Hülkenberg, also does not like street tracks. For him in particular, it's been Baku. Now, he ended up getting beaten by Ali Behrman this year in Baku, and yes, it was like a very last second thing because of the safety car and a couple of other things that were going around. But in general, it's either been a DNF, out of the points, and just not a great overall performance. This track has not really suited the style of Nico Hülkenberg, whether that be in qualifying or the race. He typically doesn't make too much positions, but the actual Haas car does okay here every year. So it's weird that Nico doesn't enjoy this track as much, but both drivers on the Haas F1 team, as of right now, do not like street tracks. Let's quickly make our way to Sauber. Sauber is just gonna have Bottas. Quickly to go over it, I think if you've followed F1 for plenty of years, you'll know that Monaco has not been the best for Bottas. Now, he did almost have potentially a very good performance in 2021, but then he had the longest pit stop ever in a lifetime, and they're still changing his tires. But he's always been on the back foot of Lewis in that Mercedes car. In these last years with the Sauber and the Alfa Romeo, it's hard to judge where he could have actually gotten to anyways. The car is just awful. But even in the Mercedes, it wasn't his best track. It's not like he was always qualifying in the top 3 or 4 even here in Monaco. He was struggling to make it there, but that also has to do with the car. So partially on the car, also Bottas. He's actually very good on almost every track. Monaco was the one outlier, I guess we could say, was that track for Bottas. Let's make it over to the podium guys, the Alpines. Now, Ocon is going to have another very familiar face. Baku is back yet again. Now, we know that there was an incident here between him and Perez. In the Alpine, it's just been a very slow car, and in both 23 and 24, and even in 22, which he did end up actually scoring a point in 22, that was quite impressive. But in 23 and 24, in the Baku GP, it just was not good performances. P15 and P15 yet again. He was slow, and that kind of continued also in his Racing Point days. It wasn't a track that favored him. That was just about it. It doesn't suit the style of Ocon. But his teammate Gasly actually has a completely different one and might be the only time we see this track, which is Australia, funny enough, for Gasly. If you actually look throughout the seasons, it's not been a good GP for him. He had potential to get a very good position in 2023. That didn't end up happening with the crash that ended up happening between both Ocon and himself. But then even racing with Red Bull and then also Toro Rosso, he ended up finishing P11 in that 2019 Red Bull, which was much faster than a P11 car. He retired in 2018 and he never ended up getting to grips with it. It's unfortunate that he couldn't finish the 2023 one. 24, he was in P13. He wasn't really making too many places up in this version of the Alpine, but Pierre Gasly and Australia just do not mix. First time we see it in this chart, and it probably will be the last time. Now let's do Williams with just Albon. He also has an outlier that most other people don't have, but we will see it on the list again, believe it or not. Alex has actually been pretty consistent on a lot of tracks. It's very easy to look at a track like Austria or even Brazil where he's crashed out twice, but those tracks have actually been pretty good track performances by him if it wasn't for the crashes that ended up happening. His actually worst track when it comes to performance and overall just extracting the pace from the car is Spain, funny enough. And that has a lot to do with the Williams also being really bad in Spain. But while he drove for other teams like Red Bull, he wasn't really performing at this GP. And it really just doesn't go with the way that Alex Albon likes to make up his time on track. It's very heavy on tire deg. And typically the tracks with a lot of downforce are kind of like not his thing. He likes the tracks where the car is a little bit more loose. Not super loose, but enough to where he can play with it. In Spain, doesn't end up suiting his style. Alex Albon, it's Spain for him. The first so far for this 2024 grid. Now we make our way to the green team, who's been having a very abysmal 2024, but let's do Lance Stroll and Fernando Alonso, starting with Lance. It was a bit tricky to figure out what track was actually the worst for him. He does have some pretty bad tracks, whether it's crashing out or just not doing well. Qualifying has always been very weak for him. In the race, he does tend to make it up sometimes, but even his tire deg is a bit iffy. So with that being said, actually Austria was the track that I ended up coming up with looking at his track record. So as I'm editing the video, I actually went back to look at Lance Stroll's amazing track record, and I don't know how I skipped over Monaco, but it's definitely Monaco that's his worst track. I mean, take a look at these very good positions. Austria has not mixed. There were a couple other tracks that I probably could have thrown in here. Brazil was almost one that I was going to throw in, but he did end up having a good 2023 performance, like a very good performance, which saved him. Otherwise, that track has not been great for him either. I guess it's the tracks with those like medium speed corners that doesn't really suit the style of Lance. But then we move on to the Rookie of the Year, Fernando Alonso, and there's one track that has stood out, and I don't even think it has much to do with him. When you look at Fernando Alonso's track record, you could arguably throw up Abu Dhabi because of certain things that have happened and him just not being able to make up places on certain years. But that track has still been okay. Mexico in specific has been DNF, DNF, DNF. And unfortunately, it just has to go as the worst track for Fernando because he never finishes. And we never actually see a position here in Mexico for him. On his 400 GP, he ended up retiring. In 23, he ended up retiring. In 22, he ended up retiring. It's a bad luck track for Fernando. So that is why it's his worst track throughout his career. Now we look at Yuki, and Yuki is similar to Fernando with Mexico because he's never able to finish here, but it's usually due to his own reasonings of crashing out. Now Mexico is up there for Yuki, but so is Monza. These two tracks, Yuki has never finished in the points, has never actually finished the races themselves in his 4 seasons he's been here in Formula 1. And it just always seems to go south for Yuki in Mexico or Monza. So any track with an M, maybe Yuki should not even try driving. It's just been one of those tracks where he's either crashing out or not finishing. It's just unfortunate for Yuki, but as well as him kind of sticking his nose in places where he doesn't need to. Now we move on to the top 4 teams, and these are drivers that are usually veterans of our sport, with the exception of George, obviously. The rest of them have been in our sport for a good long time, so it's nice to analyze this. Let's start off with Lewis, who is by far the most difficult on this list to figure out what track is actually bad for him. I would say even looking at this, I did have to give him a worse track, but there isn't a track that he's actually bad at. He's always been good at every track, and looking at the list of races, and as you can see, the blue is when he's out of the points. It's a very small amount of times throughout his career that Lewis was not in points. So try figuring that out for what his worst track is. The only conclusion I could come to, and it has a lot to do with the car as well, I said this for Bottas, that Mercedes car wasn't great in Monaco when it had that long wheelbase throughout the turbo hybrid season before going to the floor ground effect era. So for Lewis, I put Monaco up there. It's not been his best track. He's had still wins there and a good amount of them, but he's also had bad performances. It's very up and down. It's just the only track that I can say Lewis wasn't great at Monaco. That's about it. He was still very good. But then looking at his teammates, George is also very hard to figure out. He was in a Williams for a long time. That was a dustbin. But then moving over to Mercedes, the only track that I can say has not been great for George has been Singapore, and specifically because 22, he ended up crashing the Mick Schumacher, was very behind. 23, he ended up crashing the barrier, could not catch Lando and Carlos. And while 24 was an okay performance, in general, Singapore has not been his greatest. Imola was also another contender for George. But the first time we see Singapore, actually shockingly, I thought we would see this much more, but George Russell is the only Singapore for a 2024 grid. But now we look at McLaren, which is Lando, and he is the driver that's either getting the most love this year or the most hate. It's not really been in between for the guy. But throughout his career, Lando's been pretty consistent on almost every track, and he is the only driver on this list that has very specific tracks that just have not worked for him, and I'm not sure why, because both of these tracks have very different philosophies, and I'm talking about Canada and Spa, Belgium to be specific. Now, these tracks are very different in characteristics, but Canada, he's qualified towards the back both times. Maybe because of the wet weather. He did have an okay 24, and he probably should have won that race if it wasn't for the safety car and McLaren doing another blunder, which is common for McLaren in 2024. But overall, his finishes in Canada have not been great, and Spa is the same thing. In the fastest car in 2024, he couldn't make up positions here in Spa, but then even the year before, it wasn't that great. They ended up putting on a wrong rear wing. He just hasn't been very racy on that track. He did have some bad luck as well. It's also a driver that's very hard to tell. He's very consistent on almost every track, but these are the very few outliers that have not been very good for him. Now we move our way to the last team, the very fast Ferrari team. It's been exceptional this year in 2024, made up with those upgrades. Let's look at Carlos Sainz, who is leaving the team at the end of the season. Well, for Carlos, it's also, yet again, like I've been saying throughout this whole video, it's very hard to tell what track's been bad for him. But there are tracks that have not usually suited his style, and Mexico and Baku are typically those tracks. But looking at his track record, he's still been very consistent in both Mexico and Baku. If it isn't for an engine failure or just overall car performance lacking, Carlos has still been there. The only track that he has not performed on very well is China. It's just been a track where he's always been on the back foot of his teammate. He ended up almost getting caught by Fernando Alonso in the green dustbin in 2024. So Carlos has not had the best track record here. He did have an okay sprint. That is where he overtook Fernando and had a decent GP. But China has not really been his favorite track to say. Mexico and Baku go against his driving style. And I think China is also along with that. He likes understeer. Try having understeer into turn one. It's very difficult, and Carlos has not really been at one with that track. Now, Leclerc is also, yet again, a very difficult driver to find a worse track for. And he does go along with one other driver, shockingly enough. It is Alex Albon. Both of them do not like the Spanish GP, and I found this to be quite a shock. He did have an excellent 2022 GP in the fastest car, that Ferrari. He was able to make a huge gap and had a great qualifying performance. But that was before we had this new Spain track without the actual chicane at the end. 23, he was very bad there, and 24 wasn't exceptional either. It's just not been a track that's really been going the way for Charles Leclerc, and unfortunately for that reason, it's his worst track. But yet again, it's still not bad. It's like in the middle. It's not a horrible track for him. And last, we're looking at the Red Bull boys. We're looking at Checo and Max. And as for Checo, it might surprise you, but the king of the streets actually does not like Monaco. Yes, he did end up winning it in 22, but every other season before that, he was either out of the points or not even close with his teammates. So it's not actually been his best track, regardless of what the media kind of tries to portray about his Monaco performances. But alongside with that, it's actually Silverstone. Silverstone, yet again, in 22 was not that bad, but actually throughout his career, it's been inconsistent performances, DNFs, out of the points. And in the 2023 car, he wasn't in the points. It's just been a mess. And yes, you could say that is because he crashed with Charles Leclerc, and who you put the blame on, that's up to you. Regardless, he was in the fastest car by far that season and could not make up places. It's just not a track that suits his particular, also very understeered driving style. So for that reason, Checo does not mix with Monaco or Silverstone, also very different tracks in track philosophy. And just like Lewis, Max was pretty much impossible to look at. It is a lot of pink for him, which are retirements. That was something that was very common for Max back when he was a rookie, or even within his 3 to 4 years in Formula One. Now we don't see as many retirements. Throughout his career, he's always said he hates these tracks and does not like the style of them. It's been pretty easy to figure that out, at least. He's still been very good at them, but it's Baku and Monaco. Street tracks for Max do not suit the way that he drives. That aggressive tone and being on the nose is very hard to actually set up for both Baku and Monaco. And if the car isn't working perfectly like it was in 23, and when he put in that beauty of a lap, unfortunately these two tracks have not been his favorite and his worst tracks of his career. Still not bad, not even middle. I would still say they're both very good tracks. But he has lost to Checo now twice in Baku, and also Monaco has not been, as I said, it's not been his favorite. But I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments below. You think I missed something? I went through all the statistics on all the races, so it did take a while to do this. I would love it if you guys subscribe. But anyways, if you enjoyed the video, please leave a like. I'll see you guys in the next one, and peace.